Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a heartwarming moment that changes everything when Grandma quietly asks, "Have you and Truong thought about getting married?" And suddenly, their whole future feels real. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos coming up. Afternoon shadows stretched long across the garden beds. Truong climbed up onto the wooden frame, looping steel wire over the top to shape the gourd trellis. Every motion was careful, steady hands, strong shoulders, no wasted movement. Below him, Tieu lifted the young gourd vines and looked up with a tight, worried voice. "Be careful up there," she said. "It's so high." Truong glanced down and gave her that calm little smile that always made her breathe easier. "I know," he said gently. "Just hand me the vines." She passed them up one by one, her fingers lingering a second too long on the stems, her eyes never leaving his silhouette against the pale sky. Sweat slid down his temple and fell to the soil in slow drops. Each drop seemed to echo the same thought in her chest. Please don't slip. Please don't fall. Truong didn't stop working. He tightened the wire, tested the tension with a firm tug, then looked down again. "I can handle it." A few steps away, Grandma and Tieu had turned the yard into their own little world. They were playing hide and seek between the rows, the air full of giggles and quick footsteps. Tieu pressed both palms over his eyes like that was the most serious job in the world. 1, 2, 3, he counted, voice bright and sing-song. Grandma took tiny, playful steps behind a cluster of leafy greens, not even trying to hide well. She wanted him to win. Tieu dropped his hands and sprinted forward, scanning dramatically like a tiny detective. "Where are you, Grandma?" he called, and his laugh popped out before he could even finish the question. When he found her, his whole face lit up like he'd discovered treasure. "I caught you!" Grandma opened her arms wide. "Oh, so clever," she praised, pulling him in for a big hug. "You got Grandma!" Tieu squealed and bounced in her arms, tiredness forgotten. His toy car dangled from one hand, but he barely remembered it existed. Tieu looked over at them, and something inside her eased. Her child was happy. Grandma looked content. And even with all the work, there was this warm feeling in the air, like their little home was becoming real, not just something they were trying to hold together. Truong climbed down carefully, boots landing solidly on the ground. He wiped his hands on his pants, then looked up at the trellis like a builder checking his work. "Okay," he said. "Trellis is done. Feels solid?" Tieu stepped closer, lightly touching the posts and the wire as if she could measure safety with her fingertips. Her eyes shone a little as she looked at him. They moved together to plant more gourds near the base, spacing the seedlings the way Truong liked: neat, practical, easy for the vines to climb. Their hands brushed now and then, small accidental touches that didn't feel accidental at all. In the fading light, warmth spread through her chest, melting the day's pressure. Earlier, she'd been tangled up in worry about the child's cough, about the heavy labor, about money, about the future. But right here, with dirt under her nails and Truong beside her, everything felt simpler. She glanced at his hands, calloused, rough, tired from work. Those hands had built so much already, and even when the climb was risky, even when the day was hard, he stayed steady. Like an anchor she could hold on to when her thoughts started spinning. Tieu reached for his hand, this time on purpose, and wrapped her fingers around his. "Thank you," she said. Truong squeezed back without hesitation. "No," he answered softly. "Thank you for being here." For a moment, they both looked up at the new trellis, the young vines waiting to climb. It wasn't just a garden project anymore. It looked like a promise, a future, a home that could hold laughter, green rows, and children growing in love. Du ran over at full speed and hugged her leg like he always did when he got excited. "Mommy," he announced proudly. "I caught Grandma." Tieu laughed and knelt down, lifting him into her arms. "You did?" she asked, kissing his cheek. "My brave boy." Du beamed like he'd just won a championship. Grandma strolled up behind him. "He's too fast," she teased. "I can't hide from him at all." Truong chuckled, and for a second, the yard felt like a scene that could live forever in her memory. The sun dipped toward the west, washing the garden in soft orange. Tieu, and Truong sat on the low stool to rest, hands still caked with soil, arms heavy in that satisfying way after real work. They stared at the lush green rose. The new trellis standing tall like a quiet guardian. "Healthy land draws birds," Tieu said quietly, watching a small bird flutter down near the edge of the bed. Truong nodded. "It's peaceful here." They looked at each other, smiles tired but real. Not the forced kind, the kind that comes when you're worn out, but your heart still feels full. Grandma carried Du over. He wasn't a baby anymore. He clutched his toy car, eyes bright and cheeks warm from running. "Did you have fun playing?" Grandma asked him. Du nodded hard. "Yes." Tieu smoothed his hair back and brushed dirt from his forehead. "Tomorrow you go to school again," she reminded him gently. "Learn English better, okay?" Du grinned and threw his arms around her neck. "Okay, Mommy." Truong stood up, stretching his back, then moved toward the bean bed with the calm determination that never left him. "Just a little more," he told her. "You rest." Tieu shook her head immediately. "I'll do it with you." He didn't argue, he just made room beside him. Together, they started pulling weeds. Each tug felt like clearing out more than just the garden. It felt like pulling out the day's fatigue, shaking loose the worries that had clung to her since morning. A gentle breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh greens. It smelled like effort and life. Tieu realized how much the mood had shifted. Earlier, she'd been tense, her mind stuck on small fears, Du coughing, the baby on the way, the weight of responsibilities. But now she felt calm, the kind of calm that came from being surrounded by people who didn't leave. Her thoughts drifted to Tet, as they often did once the air started feeling like change. "Yeah," he replied. "Mom stays with us." Grandma, who had settled nearby with Du, chimed in with a pleased smile. "I'll spend Tet here," she said. "It'll be joyful." The words landed in Tieu's chest like a warm blanket. A reunion, not just a holiday. A family, not just a dream. She looked at Truong, dirt on his hands, sweat on his brow, but steady. She looked at Du, bright-eyed, safe. She looked at Grandma, warm, present, real. And for once, life's pressures didn't feel like a storm overhead. They felt manageable. Like maybe love could carry the weight. Without making a big show of it, she reached for Truong's hand again. Du started running circles around them, pushing his toy car along the ground and making his own sound effects. His laughter floated through the twilight like music, turning the yard into something sacred. In that soft, fading light, the garden wasn't just a place to grow vegetables anymore. It was where their hearts filled up, where the future took root, day by day, in small acts, wire tightened, weeds pulled, hands held, twilight deepened, a gentle veil over the newly built gourd trellis. Truong did one last check, securing a final twist in the wire with firm fingers. He stepped back and nodded at his work. "All done," he said in a low voice. "It's solid." Tieu stood below him, looking up like she was seeing more than wood and wire. "You're amazing," she said. And she didn't say it lightly. They inspected it together, moving along the frame, their shoulders brushing, warmth spreading, even as the air cooled. Nearby, Grandma and Du started another round of hide and seek, like they could play forever. Count, Grandma said, laughing. Grandma will hide. Tieu covered his eyes again. 1, 2, 3. He counted softly, then burst forward, searching with dramatic excitement. When he caught her, Grandma scooped him up and spun him in a circle. So clever, my boy. Tieu squealed, his laughter sharp and bright, cutting through the quiet like a happy bell. Tieu watched it all, her heart flooding with gratitude. Her child was growing in laughter, in safety, in Grandma's arms. She shook her head slowly, meaning every word. With you, she said. With our child. With Mum. I'm not tired. Grandma walked over with Tieu in her arms, smiling. Are you two finished? She asked. Tieu leaned down and hugged Tieu's leg. All done, he announced proudly, like he'd built the trellis himself. Tieu lifted him, kissing his cheek. Such a good boy. For a moment, the atmosphere quieted. Just soft wind, distant night sounds, the lingering feeling of laughter. And then, night came fully. Warm, golden light spilled from the small house onto the yard as they went inside. Tieu carried sleepy Tieu to his bed, laying him down carefully as if he might break. She stroked his hair until his breathing evened out, the room filled with that peaceful hush only sleeping children bring. Truong stood at the doorway, watching his wife and son with a tenderness he didn't always know how to put into words. Grandma sat nearby, her voice warm, low, serious in the gentlest way. Tieu froze for half a second, her fingers still on Tieu's hair. She looked up, meeting Truong's eyes. The air shifted soft, but heavy with meaning. Truong stepped in and sat beside her. We've thought about it, Mum, he said quietly. Grandma smiled, but her eyes glistened like she'd been holding this hope for a long time. The baby is coming. Tieu is growing. Our family should be properly together. Tieu lowered her head, and tears slipped out before she could stop them. Not loud sobs, just silent tears that carried every struggle, every fear, every prayer she'd whispered in the dark. I understand. Grandma reached out and took her hand firmly, like sealing a promise. I'll stay for Tet with you all, she said. Then I'll help care for Tieu and the new baby. Just come live as one home. Truong squeezed Tieu's hand harder, steady as always. I'll take care of everything, he promised. Don't worry. Silence settled over the room, filled only by Tieu's calm breathing and the soft sound of wind outside. Tieu felt this was the biggest turning point of the day. It started with garden work and simple joy, and now it ended with a real vow forming right in front of her. She remembered the early struggles, the quiet love between her and Truong that grew slowly but deeply, the baby soon to arrive. Everything seemed to gather into this one moment. Grandma continued, her voice brightening, as if she could already see the celebration. This year, we wrap chung cake inside, she said. We buy new clothes for the kids. We celebrate Tet happily. I'll try my best. Truong wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Seeing you like this, she murmured, makes me so happy. Outside, the night deepened, but inside that small house, under warm light and quiet promises, their hearts brimmed with hope. The day ended, but their family story felt like it was just beginning, built on love, closeness, and a vow for a complete home. In the late afternoon, Truong carefully builds a sturdy gourd trellis, while Tieu watches anxiously, afraid he might fall. Nearby, Grandma and little Tieu play hide and seek, filling the garden with laughter and easing Tieu's tension. As the work finishes, the family rests together, enjoying the peaceful rows of green plants and the warm feeling of being home. Tieu and Truong weed the bean bed, side by side, talking about Tet plans and hoping for a joyful holiday as one family. That evening, After Tieu puts a sleepy Dieu to bed, Grandma gently brings up marriage, urging Truong and Tieu to make their family proper before the new baby arrives. Emotional but hopeful, Tieu agrees. Truong promises to handle everything, and the night ends with a tender sense of commitment and a brighter future.